On a quiet Sunday afternoon in a small California city, a child stepped outside her home and did not return. The street looked ordinary, familiar, safe. Neighbors were nearby. Families were inside their houses. Nothing about the moment suggested it would become one of the most disturbing crimes the community would ever face. Within hours, concern turned into alarm. By nightfall, an entire city was searching for answers that did not come. There were no clear witnesses, no obvious signs of struggle, and no explanation that made sense. What began as a missing child alert quickly exposed how fragile certainty can be, even in places that feel protected. The absence left behind questions that grew heavier with each passing hour, and a silence that would not break easily. Before we continue, if you want to follow investigations like this one, you can subscribe here. Sandra Cantu lived with her family in Tracy, California, a city shaped by suburban neighborhoods and open agricultural land. She was 8 years old, known in her community, and familiar to the people who lived nearby. On March 27, 2009, she spent part of the day outside near her home. The activities were ordinary and unremarkable. There was no indication of conflict or distress. At some point that afternoon, contact with her stopped. When Sandra did not return home as expected, her family reported her missing. Tracy police responded immediately. The early response treated the situation as urgent, recognizing that time matters most in cases involving missing children. Officers began canvassing the neighborhood, speaking with residents, and checking nearby areas where a child might wander. Word spread quickly. Neighbors joined the search. Volunteers walked streets, yards, and open spaces. Local businesses shared information. The effort expanded beyond immediate surroundings as hours passed without results. Law enforcement coordinated with regional agencies to broaden coverage. Early information provided a narrow timeline. Sandra had been seen near her home earlier that day. No confirmed sightings followed. There was no evidence she had planned to go anywhere else. Personal items that would normally be taken on a longer outing were not missing. These details suggested she had expected to return. As daylight faded, concern intensified. Search teams worked into the evening. Patrol units extended their reach to nearby fields, canals, and undeveloped land common around Tracy. Officers checked places that could pose danger to a child, including irrigation areas and isolated paths. The community response grew rapidly. Residents opened garages, sheds, and backyards for inspection. Flyers were prepared. Media outlets arrived and began reporting on the disappearance. The city shifted into a collective vigilance. Investigators worked carefully to preserve accuracy. Tips began coming in almost immediately. Each piece of information had to be evaluated, documented, and verified. Law enforcement avoided drawing conclusions early. At this stage, uncertainty defined every decision. By the next day, the search expanded further. Law enforcement resources increased. A command structure was established to coordinate volunteers and officers. Search dogs were deployed. Aerial observation was used to scan larger areas. The goal was coverage rather than theory. Sandra's family remained at the center of the effort, cooperating fully with authorities. They provided details about her routine, habits, and recent activities. Investigators compared this information with search findings to identify any deviation from normal patterns. Despite the scale of the response, no clear trace emerged. There were no confirmed sightings. No physical evidence pointed in a specific direction. This absence made the investigation more difficult. In missing child cases, lack of information can be as significant as presence of evidence. As hours turned into days, the investigation shifted cautiously. While search efforts continued, investigators began considering the possibility that Sandra had not simply wandered away. This consideration did not replace search operations. It existed alongside them, guiding additional steps without assuming outcome. Law enforcement began examining people who had been in the area. This process did not involve accusation. It involved understanding who might have seen something or who might provide context for unexplained absence. Interviews were conducted methodically. The city remained engaged. Community members attended vigils and search briefings. Schools and local organizations offered support. The disappearance affected daily life, altering routines and heightening awareness. Media coverage increased, bringing wider attention. Authorities used this exposure carefully, asking for information while maintaining restraint. Protecting the integrity of the investigation remained a priority. Throughout this period, investigators documented every action. Search locations were logged, tips were recorded, timelines were refined repeatedly as new information was evaluated. This documentation would become critical as the case developed. Despite intense effort, Sandra was not found during the initial search period. The lack of resolution placed pressure on investigators and the community alike. Each unanswered question widened the scope of concern. The disappearance marked a turning point for Tracy. It challenged assumptions about safety and familiarity. A child had vanished in daylight from a neighborhood where people knew each other. The reality unsettled residents and demanded answers. By the end of the first days, the investigation had not produced clarity, but it had established structure. Search operations were comprehensive. Early investigative steps were in place. The community had mobilized fully. What remained was uncertainty. That uncertainty would soon give way to discovery that changed the direction of the investigation entirely. The moment Sandra went missing set into motion events that would move from search to criminal inquiry, reshaping the case and the city that surrounded it. The disappearance of Sandra Cantu pushed the city of Tracy into sustained urgency. What began as neighborhood concern expanded into coordinated action involving law enforcement, volunteers, and regional agencies. The focus remained singular: locating a missing child as quickly as possible. Search operations were organized with structure. Tracy police established command points to manage information and movement. Officers divided areas into zones, assigning teams to streets, open land, and waterways common to the region. The surrounding environment included irrigation canals, fields, and service roads that required careful attention. These areas were searched repeatedly because of the risk they posed and the ease with which a child could wander into them. Volunteers arrived in large numbers. Residents, local workers, and community groups joined search efforts under police guidance. Participation was managed deliberately to avoid contamination of potential evidence. Law enforcement emphasized order and documentation. Each area searched was recorded to prevent duplication and to ensure coverage. Canine teams were deployed to assist in locating scent trails. Handlers worked methodically, following procedures designed to preserve reliability. While canine teams can be helpful, investigators remained cautious about interpretation. Scent work was treated as one tool among many, rather than definitive direction. Aerial resources were also used. Aircraft surveyed larger areas that could not be covered on foot. These efforts focused on open land, drainage systems, and isolated spaces that might otherwise be overlooked. Visibility varied, and repeated passes were necessary. At the same time, investigators began building a detailed timeline. They documented Sandra's known movements earlier in the day and identified the last confirmed sightings. This timeline was refined continuously as information was verified. Accuracy mattered more than speed. Investigators avoided assumptions even when pressure mounted. Officers canvassed the neighborhood systematically. They spoke with residents, delivery workers, and anyone who might have been present. The The goal was not accusation, but information. Each contact was logged. Even statements that seemed insignificant were recorded, recognizing that small details can gain importance later. Media coverage intensified. Law enforcement used public attention to request information while maintaining control over details. Authorities released limited descriptions and encouraged anyone with knowledge to come forward. Care was taken not to release information that could mislead or compromise the investigation. As days passed without resolution, investigators began examining broader possibilities. This did not mean abandoning search efforts. It meant expanding inquiry while continuing physical searches. Law enforcement recognizes that missing child cases can change rapidly, and preparation for multiple outcomes is necessary. Investigators reviewed known offenders in the area, focusing on individuals with documented histories relevant to missing child cases. This review was handled quietly. Background checks were conducted as part of standard procedure without public disclosure. Family cooperation remained central. Sandra's relatives provided access to personal information, routines, and habits. Investigators assessed whether anything unusual had occurred in the days leading up to the disappearance. No clear warning signs emerged. This absence complicated analysis. Community support remained strong. Local schools, churches, and organizations offered assistance. Vigil gatherings reflected shared concern rather than conclusion. The atmosphere was one of collective worry rather than panic. Despite the intensity of effort, tangible results were limited. No confirmed sightings were reported after the initial disappearance. No personal belongings were found that could explain where Sandra had gone. Each search cycle ended without answers, increasing the weight of uncertainty. Law enforcement maintained discipline. Investigators avoided public speculation. Internally, they continued to reassess strategies, adjusting search areas and investigative focus as information was reviewed. The process was iterative and cautious. As time progressed, the investigation required balance. Resources had to be sustained without exhaustion. Search teams rotated. Command staff evaluated which efforts remained productive. Decisions were made based on evidence rather than hope. The absence of immediate findings did not reduce urgency, it changed its form. The investigation transitioned from emergency response to sustained inquiry, while still prioritizing recovery. This shift is common in prolonged missing person cases, especially involving children. Throughout this period, documentation was critical. Reports were written in detail. Search logs were preserved. Interview notes were maintained carefully. Investigators understood that if answers did not come quickly, future review would depend on the integrity of early records. The city remained alert. Parents altered routines. Public spaces felt different. The disappearance affected daily life, reinforcing how deeply the situation had penetrated the community. As days passed, law enforcement continued to evaluate next steps. The search had been extensive. The investigation had gathered information without resolution. The absence of explanation increasingly suggested that the disappearance was not accidental. This realization did not produce immediate conclusions. It guided preparation. Investigators ensured that if evidence emerged, they would be ready to respond. The groundwork laid during this period would soon prove essential. The early investigation did not provide answers, but it established foundation. It preserved opportunity for later discovery by maintaining discipline, accuracy, and restraint. The efforts undertaken during these first days ensured that when clarity finally arrived, it would be supported by careful work rather than rushed judgment. The search for Sandra Cantu entered a different reality when routine patrol work intersected with an overlooked part of the landscape. Several days had passed since she was last seen, and despite extensive effort, no trace had explained her disappearance. Investigators continued scanning areas that combined isolation with accessibility, places close enough to neighborhoods yet distant from daily foot traffic. On March 30, 2009, law enforcement attention returned to an irrigation pond located on West Clover Road, outside the immediate residential area of Tracy. The location was not unfamiliar to search teams. It sat among open land used for agriculture, bordered by dirt roads and vegetation that limited visibility from a distance. The pond was accessible by vehicle, yet rarely visited without purpose. A farm worker in the area noticed an object partially submerged in the water. From a distance, it appeared unusual, inconsistent with debris commonly found near irrigation sites. Law enforcement was notified, and officers responded to assess the situation. The area was secured immediately, and access was restricted to preserve potential evidence. Officers confirmed the object was a suitcase. Its presence in the pond raised immediate concern. Investigators approached the scene with caution, aware that the discovery could be connected to the ongoing search. Procedures shifted from recovery to crime scene protocol. The pond and surrounding area were treated as a potential homicide scene. Specialized personnel were called to assist with retrieval. The suitcase was removed carefully from the water and documented before being opened. Inside, investigators found the body of a child. Identification procedures followed standard protocol, prioritizing accuracy and confirmation through official means rather than assumption. Authorities later confirmed that the body was Sandra Cantu. The confirmation ended the search phase of the investigation and marked the transition to a homicide inquiry. The disappearance was no longer a missing persons case. It was now a confirmed murder investigation. The location of the pond immediately became significant. Investigators documented its distance from Sandra's home, the route required to reach it, and the conditions that could allow someone to travel there without notice. The pond's isolation explained why earlier searches had not revealed the suitcase despite extensive coverage elsewhere. Crime scene technicians processed the area thoroughly. The pond, nearby ground, and access points were examined for physical evidence. Every step was documented to preserve the integrity of findings. The condition of the suitcase and its placement were recorded in detail. Authorities were careful in public communication. They confirmed the discovery and identification without releasing unnecessary detail. Given that the victim was a child, officials emphasized restraint and respect. The focus remained on investigation rather than description. News of the discovery spread quickly through Tracy. The community response shifted from anxious hope to collective grief. Vigils were held. Public gatherings reflected mourning rather than search coordination. The emotional tone of the city changed as uncertainty gave way to confirmation. For investigators, the discovery brought clarity alongside responsibility. With confirmation of homicide, the scope of the investigation narrowed. Attention turned toward determining how Sandra had been taken, who had access to her, and how her body came to be placed in the pond. The suitcase itself became a central piece of evidence. Investigators have examined where it may have been purchased, how it was transported, and whether it could be linked to any individual through records or witness information. This analysis required careful comparison with local retail data and travel routes. The timing of the placement also mattered. Investigators considered when the suitcase could have been placed in the pond without detection. This required analysis of traffic patterns, agricultural activity, and visibility at different times of day. The pond's proximity to residential areas raised further questions. While isolated, it was not remote. Someone familiar with the area would know how to reach it efficiently. This familiarity suggested local knowledge rather than random selection. Law enforcement also examined the broader environment. The agricultural landscape included service roads, equipment access paths, and areas shielded from view. Investigators assessed how these features could facilitate movement without drawing attention. As the investigation progressed, authorities reiterated the importance of verified information. They urged anyone with relevant knowledge to come forward, while cautioning against speculation. The integrity of the investigation remained a priority. The discovery also brought scrutiny to earlier search efforts. Investigators reviewed why the suitcase had not been found so soon. This review was not about fault. It was about understanding limitations and ensuring that future searches accounted for similar environments. The transition from search to homicide investigation altered resource allocation. Specialized units became involved, evidence handling protocols intensified. The investigation moved from broad coverage to focused inquiry. Sandra Cantu's disappearance had already affected Tracy deeply. The discovery of her body confirmed the worst fears held quietly by many. The community now faced the reality of violent crime within its boundaries. For investigators, the discovery brought a turning point. The absence that defined the first days was replaced by evidence that demanded explanation. The task ahead was no longer finding Sandra, it was identifying who was responsible for her death. The irrigation pond, once an unremarkable feature of the landscape, became central to the case. Its role in concealing evidence highlighted how ordinary places can become critical in criminal investigations. With confirmation established, the investigation entered a new phase, defined by forensic analysis, suspect identification, and legal preparation. The foundation laid during the search period now supported a more directed effort. The discovery near the irrigation pond reshaped the case entirely. It provided answers to the most immediate question, while opening many others. The search had ended, but the pursuit of accountability had only begun. With the discovery confirmed, investigators moved with controlled precision. The priority shifted to preserving evidence and establishing facts that could withstand legal scrutiny. Every action taken from this point forward carried weight. The outcome of the investigation would depend on how carefully the earliest forensic steps were handled. The suitcase recovered from the irrigation pond was treated as a primary piece of evidence. Its condition, placement, and contents were documented before transport. Investigators avoided unnecessary handling. Chain of custody procedures were established immediately to ensure accountability from recovery through analysis. The goal was to protect integrity rather than speed. The surrounding area was examined in detail. Technicians surveyed the pond edge, access roads, and nearby ground. They documented tire impressions, footprints, and disturbances consistent with recent activity. Environmental conditions were noted because water, soil, and exposure can affect evidence preservation. These observations mattered for later interpretation. The body was transferred to the coroner for examination. Because the victim was a child, authorities emphasized restraint in public communication. The examination focused on confirming identity and determining cause of death within the limits of publicly releasable information. Officials avoided unnecessary detail, prioritizing accuracy over description. Forensic confirmation established that Sandra Cantu had been the victim of homicide. This conclusion was reached through scientific examination rather than inference. The determination shifted the investigation firmly into criminal inquiry, guiding every subsequent step. Investigators also examined the suitcase itself for trace evidence. Materials, manufacturing features, and signs of handling were documented. Analysts considered how long it may have been submerged and how that exposure affected findings. Water can complicate forensic work, but it does not eliminate all potential indicators. Attention was given to how the suitcase entered the pond. Investigators assessed weight, buoyancy, and placement. These factors helped establish whether the item had been placed deliberately rather than washed in accidentally. The analysis focused on physical feasibility rather than theory. Law enforcement reviewed transportation routes connecting residential areas to the pond. They documented road access, visibility, and travel time. This review was grounded in geography and routine usage rather than speculation. Understanding access was essential to narrowing future inquiry. The victim's clothing and personal items were cataloged carefully. Investigators noted what was present and what was absent. These observations helped establish whether the child had left voluntarily or been taken suddenly. The absence of items associated with longer outings supported the latter conclusion. Throughout this process, investigators remained disciplined. They resisted pressure to draw early conclusions. Forensic work can suggest direction, but it requires corroboration. Each finding was treated as one part of a larger record. Public updates were limited. Authorities confirmed homicide and requested information without revealing sensitive details. This approach protected the investigation and avoided influencing potential witnesses. Accuracy took precedence over immediacy. The confirmation of homicide altered community response. Search efforts gave way to mourning, but investigative work intensified quietly. The city shifted from looking for a missing child to seeking accountability for a violent crime. Internally, investigators reviewed earlier search data with new context. Locations previously searched were reconsidered. Timelines were refined using forensic confirmation as an anchor point. This process did not rewrite earlier work, it built upon it. Evidence handling extended beyond physical items. Digital records, tips, and interview notes were reorganized. Investigators prepared for the possibility of long-term analysis. Documentation from the first days became critical reference material. Coordination increased between local law enforcement and specialized units. Expertise in homicide investigation supported ongoing analysis. Each agency involved understood the importance of maintaining consistency and communication. The forensic confirmation also influenced investigative priorities. Resources were allocated to follow evidence rather than possibility. This shift narrowed focus without limiting thoroughness. Investigators acknowledged the challenges ahead. Water exposure, time, and environment complicate forensic certainty. These challenges required patience and careful interpretation. The absence of immediate answers did not reduce confidence in process. The handling of evidence during this period set the tone for the entire investigation. Mistakes at this stage can compromise cases permanently. Law enforcement approached the task with awareness of that responsibility. Sandra Cantu's death was now established as a criminal act. The confirmation did not explain how or why, but it provided a foundation grounded in fact. From that foundation, investigators could move forward methodically. The case entered a phase defined by careful accumulation rather than urgency. Evidence was preserved, facts were confirmed. The groundwork was laid for identifying responsibility without relying on assumption. What followed would depend on how effectively this foundation supported deeper inquiry. The forensic confirmation did not close the case, it gave it direction. Once homicide was confirmed, investigators shifted from broad inquiry to focused evaluation. The disappearance and recovery had established that Sandra Cantu had not wandered away and had not encountered accidental harm. Someone had taken deliberate action, and that action occurred within a limited geographic and temporal window. The task now was to determine who had access, opportunity, and proximity. Investigators returned to the neighborhood with renewed purpose. Earlier canvassing had gathered information broadly. Now those records were reviewed again with sharper criteria. Officers looked closely at who had been present during the afternoon Sandra disappeared, who had routine access to the area, and who could move without attracting attention. The investigation focused on familiarity rather than strangers. Sandra had vanished close to home, in a place where she felt safe. This suggested that whoever approached her did not cause immediate alarm. Investigators considered how children typically respond to adults they recognize versus those they do not. This understanding guided attention toward people known within the neighborhood or connected to families nearby. Law enforcement examined household routines along Sandra's street. They reviewed who was home that day, who came and went, and who had unsupervised time. This process relied on interviews, observation, and documentation rather than assumption. Each detail was cross-checked against timelines already established. Investigators also reviewed community connections. Sandra's daily activities, play areas, and social interactions were mapped carefully. This mapping helped identify overlap between her movements and those of adults who might encounter her regularly. The goal was pattern recognition, not accusation. Attention turned to individuals who had previously interacted with Sandra. This included neighbors, family acquaintances, and people who had reasons to be nearby. Investigators assessed these interactions factually. Familiarity alone did not imply wrongdoing. It established access. During this review, inconsistencies began to stand out. Statements provided earlier were revisited and compared. Investigators noted where accounts changed over time or conflicted with verifiable details. Such discrepancies did not automatically indicate guilt, but they warranted closer examination. Investigators also considered physical capability and logistics. Transporting a child, placing a body in a soup can, and moving that suitcase to an irrigation pond required planning and strength. This assessment helped narrow the pool further by eliminating scenarios that did not align with physical reality. Records were reviewed beyond the immediate neighborhood. Vehicle access, travel routes, and timing were analyzed. Investigators examined who could travel to the pond location quickly without drawing attention. This analysis relied on geography and routine movement patterns rather than theory. As focus narrowed, law enforcement remained cautious. High-profile cases involving children can generate pressure to identify a suspect quickly. Investigators resisted that pressure. They understood the consequences of premature conclusions, both legally and for the community. Public communication remained restrained. Authorities confirmed that the investigation was ongoing, but avoided naming individuals or releasing speculative information. Protecting the integrity of the process remained central. Internally, coordination increased. Investigators shared findings across units, comparing notes, and evaluating whether emerging patterns held under scrutiny. This collaborative review helped reduce individual bias and ensured that conclusions were supported collectively. One individual began to draw increasing attention based on proximity and behavioral factors. Investigators did not act immediately. Instead, they gathered additional information to test whether this focus was supported consistently across evidence categories. They examined schedules, movements, and interactions. They reviewed statements again, comparing them against timelines and physical evidence. This methodical approach allowed investigators to confirm whether initial concerns were justified. Throughout this process, investigators documented everything. Decisions to narrow focus were recorded with supporting rationale. This documentation would later become critical in court proceedings, where investigative steps must be explained clearly and defended. The narrowing of the suspect pool did not produce immediate arrest. It produced direction. The investigation moved from broad uncertainty toward specific inquiry grounded in fact. The community continued to watch closely. While law enforcement could not share details, the shift in investigative posture was noticeable. The search phase had ended. The inquiry phase had matured. Investigators recognized that narrowing focus carried responsibility. Once attention centers on an individual, every step must be justified and lawful. Evidence must be gathered properly and rights must be respected. Any error could jeopardize accountability. The careful narrowing during this period laid the foundation for what followed. By reducing possibilities through evidence rather than speculation, investigators ensured that future action would be supported by fact. Sandra Cantu's case had moved from absence to confirmation, and now from confirmation to focus. The path toward accountability was becoming clearer, shaped by discipline, patience, and adherence to process. As investigators continued narrowing their inquiry, attention increasingly centered on one individual, whose connection to the neighborhood placed her in close proximity to Sandra Cantu during the critical period. The focus did not arise from a single discovery or sudden shift. It developed gradually as timelines, access, and behavior were examined together. Melissa Huckabee lived near Sandra's home and was familiar within the area. She was related by marriage to a neighbor and had regular access to the street where Sandra was last seen. This proximity mattered. Investigators had already determined that the disappearance occurred close to home, in daylight, without signs of struggle. That context suggested the child may not have perceived immediate danger at the moment of contact. Law enforcement reviewed Huckabee's movements on the day Sandra disappeared. Investigators compared her statements with established timelines. They examined when she was home, when she was seen by others, and how her account aligned with confirmed events. This review did not rely on suspicion alone, it relied on comparison. As interviews were revisited, inconsistencies became more apparent. Details provided at different times did not always align with one another or with verifiable facts. Investigators documented these changes carefully. Inconsistent statements do not establish guilt, but they raise questions that require explanation. Investigators also examined access. Huckabee had the ability to approach Sandra without drawing attention. Familiarity within the neighborhood meant interaction would not appear unusual. This factor was significant because no witnesses reported distress or confrontation. Physical logistics were evaluated next. Investigators considered whether Huckabee had the means to transport Sandra and later move a suitcase to the irrigation pond. Vehicle access, timing, and route familiarity were assessed against known conditions. The analysis focused on feasibility rather than theory. Law enforcement also reviewed Huckabee's behavior following the disappearance. They noted interactions with investigators, community members, and family. Investigators observed demeanor without assigning motive. Behavioral observations were used as context rather than evidence. Search records were reviewed again with this focus in mind. Areas near Huckabee's residence and routine travel paths were examined for relevance. Investigators compared these areas with the location where Sandra's body was found, considering travel time and opportunity. Investigators sought corroboration beyond interviews. They examined phone records, financial activity, and other available data. These records helped establish presence and movement rather than intent. Each piece of information was evaluated for reliability. As focus intensified, law enforcement maintained procedural caution. They understood the gravity of identifying a suspect in a case involving a child. Every step had to be supported by evidence and conducted lawfully. Investigators avoided public disclosure to prevent interference or speculation. Coordination increased between detectives and prosecutors. Legal guidance helped ensure that investigative steps aligned with evidentiary standards required for potential charges. This collaboration helped prevent errors that could undermine accountability later. The investigation also considered alternative explanations. Investigators continued to evaluate whether any other individuals could reasonably fit the established timeline and access criteria. This process was necessary to confirm that focus was justified rather than convenient. Over time, the weight of information increasingly pointed in one direction. Proximity, access, inconsistencies, and logistical feasibility aligned around Huckabee. No single factor was decisive. Together, they formed a pattern that warranted further action. Investigators began preparing for arrest procedures. This preparation did not assume outcome. It ensured readiness if probable cause was established. Warrants, evidence review, and procedural steps were planned carefully. During this period, investigators continued to gather information quietly. Surveillance and additional interviews were conducted as permitted. The goal was confirmation rather than acceleration. The community remained largely unaware of the narrowing focus. Law enforcement continued to communicate cautiously, emphasizing that the investigation was active without identifying individuals. Protecting the process remained critical. As evidence converged, investigators reached a point where further delay risked losing opportunity rather than gaining clarity. The accumulated information met legal thresholds for action. Probable cause was established based on documented facts. The focus on Melissa Huckabee represented a turning point. For the first time since Sandra disappeared, the investigation had direction supported by evidence rather than uncertainty. This direction did not resolve the case, but it allowed movement toward accountability. Investigators understood that identifying a suspect does not equal proving guilt. The next steps would require legal scrutiny, public transparency, and adherence to due process. The seriousness of the crime demanded nothing less. The case had progressed from disappearance to discovery, from discovery to confirmation, and now from confirmation to focused responsibility. The investigation stood on a foundation built carefully over days of disciplined work. With attention centered and preparations complete, law enforcement moved toward formal action. What followed would bring the case into the public record in a way that could no longer be undone. The narrowing of focus to Melissa Huckabee marked the moment when the investigation left uncertainty behind and entered the realm of accountability guided by law and evidence. Once investigators reached the point where evidence aligned consistently, the investigation moved toward action. The focus on Melissa Huckabee had been established through proximity, access, inconsistencies, and logistical feasibility. What remained was to proceed within the boundaries of law, ensuring that every step taken could withstand scrutiny. On April 6, 2009, law enforcement arrested Melissa Huckabee in connection with the murder of Sandra Cantu. The arrest took place after investigators determined that probable cause had been met. This decision was not made hastily. It followed careful review of evidence, coordination with prosecutors, and confirmation that investigative standards had been satisfied. Huckabee was taken into custody without incident. Authorities moved deliberately, aware of the seriousness of the charge and the attention surrounding the case. The arrest marked the first time since Sandra disappeared that the investigation shifted from inquiry to formal accusation. Following the arrest, Huckabee was booked into the San Joaquin County Jail. Law enforcement confirmed her identity and status while maintaining restraint in public communication. Officials released limited information focusing on the fact of the arrest rather than interpretation. Prosecutors formally charged Huckabee with murder and kidnapping. These charges reflected conclusions supported by evidence rather than narrative. Each charge carried specific legal definitions that prosecutors believed could be met based on the investigative record. The filing of charges brought the case into the judicial system. Responsibility for determining outcome began shifting from investigators to the courts. The role of law enforcement moved towards support, documentation, and testimony preparation. Authorities emphasized that the charges were based on evidence gathered through lawful means. They avoided discussing specific details publicly to protect the integrity of future proceedings. This restraint reflected awareness of both legal responsibility and public sensitivity. News of the arrest spread rapidly through Tracy and beyond. Media coverage intensified, drawing national attention. The community response was complex. Relief that a suspect had been identified existed alongside grief and disbelief. The familiarity of the accused heightened the impact. For many residents, the arrest challenged assumptions about safety and trust. Sandra had disappeared from a place considered secure. The person now accused lived nearby and was known within the community. This reality deepened the emotional weight of the case. Law enforcement acknowledged the community's response without amplifying it. Officials reiterated that arrest does not equal conviction and that the legal process would determine outcome. This message aimed to balance transparency with fairness. After the arrest, investigators continued working to strengthen the evidentiary record. The filing of charges did not conclude investigative responsibility. It altered its purpose. Evidence had to be organized for court presentation, and investigative decisions had to be explained clearly. Search warrants and evidence reviews were conducted within legal parameters. Investigators ensured that all material associated with the case was properly cataloged. Chain of custody documentation became even more critical as evidence moved toward courtroom use. Huckabee appeared in court for arraignment. The proceedings followed standard procedure. Charges were read, and the court addressed custody status. The seriousness of the allegations guided judicial decisions regarding detention. Prosecutors began preparing for trial. This preparation involved reviewing investigative steps, identifying witnesses, and ensuring that evidence could be presented in a clear and lawful manner. The age of the case did not reduce expectations for precision. The defense also entered the process. Huckabee was entitled to legal representation and due process. The court system assumed responsibility for managing the case timeline and ensuring that rights were respected on all sides. The arrest marked a turning point not just legally but symbolically. For days the city had searched without answers. Now the case had direction. That direction came with responsibility to proceed carefully and lawfully. Authorities addressed concerns about investigative bias. They emphasized that focus on Huckabee had emerged from evidence rather than assumption. This clarification was important given the community's familiarity with the accused. The arrest also prompted review of earlier investigative steps. Law enforcement examined whether anything had been overlooked or misinterpreted. This internal review aimed to strengthen the case and anticipate defense challenges. Throughout this period, communication remained controlled. Officials provided factual updates without elaboration. The goal was to inform without influencing perception. For Sandra's family, the arrest represented a shift from uncertainty to formal accountability being pursued. While the pain of loss remained, the legal process had begun addressing responsibility. The charges did not resolve the case. They initiated its most visible phase. The investigation had reached the point where evidence would be tested in court rather than gathered in the field. The disappearance that had shaken Tracy was no longer defined by absence alone. It was now defined by accusation, grounded in evidence and subject to judicial determination. As the case advanced, attention shifted toward court proceedings, where facts would be examined publicly and responsibility would be decided under law. With charges filed, the case entered the court system, where procedure replaced investigation as the primary framework. The focus shifted from gathering information to testing what had already been documented. Every action now followed established legal steps designed to protect fairness, accuracy, and due process. Early court appearances addressed custody and scheduling. Melissa Huckabee remained in custody as the seriousness of the charges guided judicial decisions. The court considered the nature of the alleged crimes, the age of the victim, and the strength of the evidence presented at that stage. These considerations shaped how the case would proceed. Prosecutors began organizing the case for trial. This work involved reviewing investigative records, confirming the admissibility of evidence, and preparing witnesses. The age of the case required careful attention to documentation. Each piece of evidence needed clear origin, handling history, and relevance. Defense counsel also prepared. Pre-trial motions addressed legal questions rather than factual conclusions. These motions challenged aspects of evidence handling, timelines, and procedural steps. Such challenges are standard and serve to clarify what information the jury will be allowed to consider. The court evaluated these motions with restraint. Decisions were grounded in legal standards rather than public interest. The judge's role was to ensure that proceedings followed law, not narrative expectation. During this period, prosecutors and defense attorneys exchanged discovery. Evidence collected during the investigation was disclosed as required. This process ensured transparency and allowed both sides to prepare adequately. The exchange included forensic findings, investigative notes, and records relevant to the case. The court also addressed scheduling. Trial preparation requires time, particularly in cases involving extensive evidence and high public attention. Continuances were considered based on preparation needs rather than delay tactics. The objective was readiness rather than speed. Media coverage remained active. Court hearings attracted attention, but officials avoided commentary outside proceedings. Judges reminded parties of the importance of avoiding statements that could influence potential jurors. Maintaining a fair trial environment remained a priority. The community continued to follow developments closely. The court process introduced structure and predictability after days of uncertainty. However, it also brought waiting. Legal proceedings move at a measured pace, especially in serious criminal cases. Investigators transitioned fully into support roles. Their responsibilities included clarifying reports, preparing testimony, and assisting prosecutors with factual questions. Fieldwork had concluded, but accountability for accuracy remained. Pre-trial hearings addressed evidentiary scope. The court ruled on what could be presented to the jury and under what conditions. These decisions shaped how the case would be understood publicly and legally. The prosecution emphasized that its case relied on evidence rather than inference. The defense emphasized the importance of presumption of innocence. These positions reflected the balance inherent in criminal proceedings. Throughout pre-trial developments, the court maintained focus on process. Each ruling was recorded. Each motion was addressed within established legal frameworks. This structure ensured that when the case reached trial, it would do so on solid procedural ground. The length of the pre-trial phase did not indicate uncertainty. It reflected the seriousness of the case. Courts recognized that outcomes in such matters must rest on careful preparation. For Sandra Cantu's family, this period required patience. The search and arrest had been public and urgent. The court phase was quieter and slower. Progress was measured in filings and rulings rather than movement. The court also addressed logistical considerations, such as jury selection procedures and courtroom management. Given the attention surrounding the case, steps were taken to ensure impartiality. These preparations aimed to protect the integrity of the verdict. As hearings concluded and motions were resolved, the case moved closer to trial readiness. The issues that could complicate proceedings were addressed in advance. This preparation reduced uncertainty once testimony would begin. The pre-trial phase demonstrated how criminal cases transition from investigation to judgment. Evidence collected under urgency must withstand scrutiny under law. The courtroom tests process as much as fact. By the end of this period, the structure of the trial had been defined. The scope of evidence was established. The roles of participants were clear. The case was positioned to move forward into the phase where responsibility would be determined by a jury rather than investigators. The court proceedings did not bring resolution, but they ensured that when resolution came, it would be grounded in lawful process rather than momentum. The case moved forward under rules designed to serve justice, not speed. As court proceedings progressed, the case reached a point where resolution no longer depended on jury determination. After months of preparation, review of evidence, and legal positioning, Melissa Huckabee chose to change her plea. This decision altered the direction of the case and brought an end to contested trial preparation. Huckabee entered a guilty plea to charges connected to the murder and kidnapping of Sandra Cantu. The plea was entered in San Joaquin County Superior Court and was accepted by the judge after required review. The court confirmed that the plea was made knowingly and voluntarily in accordance with legal standards. The plea eliminated the need for a trial. Evidence that had been prepared for presentation did not need to be argued before a jury. The legal process shifted from adjudication to sentencing preparation. The focus moved from determining responsibility to determining consequence. The guilty plea represented formal acknowledgement of responsibility within the justice system. It replaced speculation and accusation with admission under law. This admission carried legal weight and concluded the factual dispute surrounding the charges. Prosecutors outlined the terms of the plea agreement. Huckabee agreed to plead guilty in exchange for sentencing that would remove the possibility of capital punishment. The agreement reflected considerations specific to California law and the circumstances of the case. The outcome ensured permanent incarceration without parole eligibility. The court reviewed the plea agreement carefully. Judges are required to confirm that plea arrangements align with statutory limits and serve the interests of justice. In this case, the agreement was deemed appropriate given the severity of the crime and the evidence presented. During the plea hearing, the court established a factual basis for the plea. This process involved summarizing evidence sufficient to support the charges. The court did not require full narrative detail. The purpose was to confirm that the plea was grounded in fact rather than convenience. The acceptance of the plea closed the investigatory chapter of the case. Law enforcement no longer needed to prepare for testimony or respond to defense challenges. Their role transitioned to supporting sentencing proceedings and maintaining the record. For Sandra Cantu's family, the guilty plea brought an end to uncertainty regarding responsibility. While the loss remained unchanged, the legal acknowledgement of guilt removed questions about outcome. The plea avoided a trial that would have revisited details already established. The community response reflected restraint. There was no sense of celebration. The resolution was recognized as serious and final. The focus remained on the victim rather than the person who committed the crime. The plea also brought clarity to the timeline of events. While some details remained sealed or summarized, the legal admission confirmed the sequence established by investigators. The disappearance, recovery, and evidence were no longer subject to challenge. Media coverage reported the plea without elaboration. Authorities continued to emphasize accuracy and respect. The case had already received intense attention, and officials avoided statements that could sensationalize outcome. The guilty plea shortened the legal process, but it did not lessen accountability. Life imprisonment without parole represented the most severe sentence available under the agreement. The plea ensured certainty of outcome rather than risk of appeal following trial. Legal observers noted that plea agreements in serious cases often reflect pragmatic considerations. Trials carry risk for both prosecution and defense. In this case, the plea ensured a definitive result while avoiding prolonged litigation. The court scheduled sentencing proceedings following acceptance of the plea. This stage would allow formal imposition of punishment and address legal requirements associated with sentencing. The guilty plea also concluded public speculation about alternate scenarios. Responsibility was no longer debated. The legal system had recorded admission and prepared to finalize consequence. The resolution through plea did not provide answers to every question. Courts do not require comprehensive explanation beyond what supports charges. The focus remained on accountability rather than narrative completeness. For investigators, the guilty plea validated the work done during the earliest days of the case. Evidence preservation, disciplined narrowing, and lawful procedure had produced a result that withstood legal scrutiny. The guilty plea marked one of the most significant points in the case. It transformed the investigation and prosecution into record. The case no longer awaited determination. It awaited judgment. The disappearance of Sandra Cantu, once defined by absence and uncertainty, was now defined by legal responsibility. The guilty plea ensured that the case would proceed to sentencing with facts established and accountability confirmed. With admission entered and trial avoided, the justice system prepared for the final phase of criminal proceedings. The focus moved entirely to consequence and closure within law. With the guilty plea entered and accepted, the case moved toward its final criminal determination. The court no longer needed to evaluate responsibility. That question had been resolved through admission. What remained was the formal imposition of sentence under California law. Sentencing proceedings focused on consequence rather than dispute. Prosecutors presented the agreed terms of punishment, grounded in statutory requirements and the plea arrangement. The court reviewed the severity of the crime, the age of the victim, and the circumstances established through investigation and forensic confirmation. Sandra Cantu had been 8 years old. She had been taken from her neighborhood during daylight hours and killed. The manner in which her body was concealed reflected deliberate action. These facts framed the court's evaluation of sentence. The law required that punishment reflect both gravity and responsibility. The plea agreement removed the possibility of a death sentence. In exchange, Melissa Huckabee accepted life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This outcome ensured permanent incarceration, while avoiding extended litigation and appeals that often follow capital trials. The judge reviewed the agreement carefully. Courts are obligated to ensure that plea arrangements are lawful, voluntary, and appropriate. The sentencing decision followed confirmation that the agreement met those standards and aligned with statutory sentencing ranges. The sentence was imposed in San Joaquin County Superior Court. Life without parole meant that Huckabee would spend the remainder of her life in state prison with no eligibility for release. The sentence reflected the most severe punishment available under the plea. The courtroom atmosphere remained restrained. There was no debate over guilt. The proceedings were formal and deliberate, emphasizing legal process rather than emotion. The focus remained on the victim and the seriousness of the offense. For Sandra Cantu's family, sentencing represented a moment of finality within the criminal justice system. Years of uncertainty and investigation concluded with a clear legal outcome. The sentence did not alter loss, but it placed responsibility firmly on record. Public response to sentencing was subdued. The case had already reached resolution through the guilty plea. The sentence confirmed what had been expected under the agreement, rather than introducing surprise. Attention centered on acknowledgement rather than reaction. The sentencing also closed the door on criminal appeals related to trial error. Because the case was resolved through plea, issues commonly raised after jury trials did not apply. The outcome provided certainty within the legal system. Investigators and prosecutors transitioned fully out of active roles. Their responsibilities shifted to maintaining records and responding to any future legal inquiries. The work that began with a missing child report had reached its conclusion in criminal court. The sentence reinforced how the justice system addresses crimes involving children. Severe offenses carry severe consequences. The law emphasizes protection of the vulnerable and accountability for those who cause harm. The case also highlighted the role of plea agreements in serious criminal matters. While trials offer public examination, pleas can provide certainty and finality. In this instance, the agreement ensured life imprisonment without parole, rather than risking a different outcome. The sentencing did not mark the end of all legal proceedings connected to the case. Civil matters and broader accountability would follow. However, the criminal process had fulfilled its role. The legal resolution demonstrated how disciplined investigation and evidence handling lead to outcomes that withstand scrutiny. The sentence rested on a foundation built during the earliest hours of the search and preserved through careful procedure. Sandra Cantu's disappearance had once been defined by unanswered questions. The sentencing replaced those questions with accountability enforced by law. The justice system had completed its response to the crime itself. The finality of life without parole carries weight beyond the courtroom. It signals permanent consequence and removes the possibility of future reconsideration. This permanence reflected the seriousness with which the court viewed the crime. As the sentencing concluded, the case moved into its final chapters. Criminal responsibility had been established and punishment imposed. What remained was reflection on impact, lessons, and the broader record created by this investigation. The sentence closed the criminal case with clarity. It marked the end of one process and the beginning of another, focused not on punishment, but on understanding how such a crime occurred and what can be learned from it. With sentencing complete, the legal process reached finality. But the effects of Sandra Cantu's murder did not end in the courtroom. The case had altered Tracy in ways that could not be measured by verdicts or punishment. What followed was a period of collective reckoning, shaped by grief, reflection, and lasting change. For Sandra's family, the end of criminal proceedings closed a long and painful chapter. The disappearance, search, discovery, and prosecution had unfolded under intense public attention. While legal accountability had been established, the personal impact remained permanent. The family's loss could not be resolved through court outcomes, but the sentence confirmed that responsibility was no longer in question. Public statements from family members emphasized remembrance rather than retribution. The focus stayed on Sandra as a child, not on the person who caused her death. This restraint shaped how the case was remembered locally. The community learned to center the victim rather than the crime. Tracy itself experienced a lasting shift. The disappearance of a child from a familiar neighborhood challenged assumptions about safety and trust. Parents altered routines. Children were supervised more closely. Awareness replaced complacency. These changes did not fade quickly. Community gatherings following sentencing reflected a shared need for acknowledgement. Vigils, memorials, and school activities honored Sandra's life rather than revisiting details of the crime. The emphasis remained on care, protection, and vigilance. Local institutions responded with renewed attention to child safety. Schools reviewed policies. Neighborhood groups discussed communication and supervision. These actions did not stem from panic. They reflected recognition that prevention requires participation beyond law enforcement. The case also affected how residents viewed familiarity. The crime had been committed by someone connected to the neighborhood. This reality forced difficult conversations about trust and awareness. Familiarity was no longer assumed to equal safety. Law enforcement agencies engaged with the community to address concerns. Officers spoke about recognizing suspicious behavior and reporting concerns early. These discussions emphasized cooperation rather than fear. Media coverage evolved as well. After sentencing, reporting became more reflective. The narrative shifted from investigation to impact. Coverage focused on lessons rather than events, acknowledging how the case had changed the city. The community response also highlighted resilience. Tracy did not become defined by the crime. It responded by strengthening connections and emphasizing responsibility towards children. While the loss remained, it did not consume identity. For those involved in the search and investigation, the outcome brought mixed emotion. Relief that accountability had been achieved existed alongside awareness that the harm could not be undone. The case reinforced why precision and patience matter in investigations involving children. The broader public learned from the case as well. Awareness of how quickly ordinary routines can change became part of the conversation. Parents, educators, and caregivers revisited assumptions about supervision and environment. Sandra's name became associated with advocacy rather than fear. Community efforts honored her memory by emphasizing protection and attentiveness. This approach ensured that remembrance focused forward rather than backward. The case also influenced how missing child reports were viewed locally. Urgency was reinforced. The importance of early action and verification became clearer to the public. The experience reshaped expectations around response. Over time, the immediate intensity of the case softened, but its influence remained. The story became part of Tracy's history, referenced not as a moment of shock, but as a reminder of responsibility. The sentencing marked an end within law, but the community's response extended beyond that boundary. Healing did not follow a timeline set by courts. It followed personal and collective rhythms. What emerged was not closure, but understanding. The case clarified vulnerabilities, responsibilities, and the importance of vigilance without fear. It reminded the community that safety is shared. Sandra Cantu's impact extended beyond her years. Her life and loss shaped how a city viewed protection, awareness, and care. That impact remains embedded in local memory. The community response demonstrated that while crimes can fracture trust, they can also strengthen resolve. Tracy did not forget what happened. It chose to respond by reinforcing values centered on children and accountability. As time moved forward, the case became less about the crime itself and more about what it revealed. The lasting response reflected a commitment to learning rather than forgetting. The story of Sandra Cantu did not end with sentencing. It continued through the ways people chose to protect one another and remember a child whose life mattered deeply to many. The case now stands as a complete record within the justice system, defined by documented actions, verified evidence, and lawful outcomes. From disappearance to sentencing, each step followed a traceable path shaped by investigation, review, and legal process. What remains is not speculation, but a clear account of how responsibility was identified and enforced. The public record shows how quickly a missing child case can escalate and how critical early response becomes. The immediate search efforts in Tracy reflected urgency and community involvement. Those actions did not resolve the case on their own, but they preserved opportunity. Documentation from the first hours allowed later review to proceed with clarity rather than guesswork. The investigation also demonstrates how environment affects outcomes. Sandra Cantu vanished from a neighborhood that felt familiar and safe. The landscape around Tracy included open land and irrigation infrastructure that could conceal evidence. These features mattered. They shaped search strategy, delayed discovery, and complicated early certainty. Evidence handling proved central. The recovery near the irrigation pond required careful preservation and methodical analysis. Forensic confirmation did not rely on narrative. It relied on scientific examination and controlled procedure. That discipline ensured that findings could support legal accountability rather than invite challenge. The narrowing of focus highlighted the importance of access and familiarity in cases involving children. The investigation did not succeed through profiling or assumption. It succeeded through examination of proximity, opportunity, and verified inconsistency. Each factor alone meant little. Together, they formed directions supported by fact. The legal process reinforced restraint. Court proceedings followed established rules that prioritized fairness over speed. Pre-trial review tested evidence rather than amplifying it. The guilty plea resolved responsibility without requiring public reenactment or speculation. Sentencing imposed consequence consistent with law. The outcome demonstrates how accountability can be achieved without sensationalism. The case did not depend on confession, dramatic revelation, or contested trial narrative. It depended on accumulation and verification. This approach reduced risk of error and strengthened the final record. The public response evolved alongside the case. Early urgency gave way to grief, then to reflection. Media coverage shifted from search updates to legal explanation. Over time, attention focused less on the crime and more on what it revealed about safety, vigilance, and responsibility. The case also underscores how familiarity can obscure risk. The person responsible was not an unknown outsider. That reality challenged assumptions held by many in the community. It reinforced the need for awareness without fear and supervision without suspicion. From an investigative perspective, the case illustrates the value of patience. Early uncertainty did not prevent eventual clarity. Preservation of records, willingness to revisit information, and coordination between agencies allowed progress even when answers were delayed. The justice system's response extended beyond punishment. The record reflects acknowledgement of harm and responsibility. Life imprisonment without parole removed the possibility of future harm by the offender and affirmed the seriousness of crimes against children. The case also shaped local understanding of missing child response. Urgency, documentation, and verification emerged as clear priorities. These lessons extend beyond Tracy. They apply to any community facing similar circumstances. What remains in the public record is a sequence grounded in fact. A child disappeared, a search was conducted, evidence was recovered, responsibility was identified. Legal consequence followed. Each step is supported by documentation rather than interpretation. The case does not offer comfort or closure in the emotional sense. Criminal proceedings rarely do. What it offers is certainty. Unanswered questions were replaced with accountability established through law. The lasting impact of the case lies in what it clarified. Safety is not guaranteed by familiarity. Early action matters. Evidence must be preserved carefully. Accountability requires patience and discipline. Sandra Cantu's name now exists within public record not as a symbol of fear, but as a reminder of responsibility. The investigation and legal outcome demonstrate how truth can merge through careful work even under difficult circumstances. The record stands complete. It reflects loss, response, investigation, and accountability without embellishment. It serves as documentation of what happened and how the justice system responded when a child was taken and harmed. What remains is the responsibility to remember the lessons without repeating the harm. The case now belongs to history, defined not by mystery, but by fact, process, and consequence.